Hello and welcome. My name is Terry Cohan-Link, and I'm principal of LINKCO. Good afternoon and good evening. Would you let me know, those of you that have just joined us, if you can hear me and see Tom, and let me know where you're joining us from. Thank you. We've got New Jersey, we've got DC. Thank you for letting us know. Good. So you're attending the webinar, Resilient Supply Chains and Transportation in the Wake of COVID-19 with Thomas O'Brien. I'll introduce Tom in a few moments. This webinar is part of a series born out of insights shared by business leaders during conversations about the current and dynamically shifting COVID-19 business climate. The conversations resulted in a timely white paper entitled Resilient Realism, which LINKCO, that's my Siri, which LINKCO has recently published. This is my way of giving back and sharing relevant information I learned speaking with business leaders on a day-to-day basis as part of my ongoing executive search practice. In this case, I've gained permission to anonymously share what business leaders are facing and envisioning going forward, and crafted these insights into a white paper. If you want to receive a copy, just let me know in the Q&A box, and I'll send it to you via email. In the wake of COVID-19, many of the respondents have been grappling with remote workforces, new challenges of workflow and timetables, how to evaluate work products, cybersecurity, and privacy from off-site locations, how to lead remotely with loved ones sharing workspace and unanticipated demands on normal work time, to note but a few of the insights, disruptors, and challenges discussed in the white paper. Today's webinar focuses on supply chains and transportation, critically important and dynamically changing due to the pandemic. They are critical key commercial avenues facing COVID-19 disruptors, yet also foreshadowing opportunities. How are supply chains and transportation modes changing during COVID-19 due to the rolling shelter-in-place requirements, a newly remote workforce, and general pandemic fears? What is the new normal going to look like? That was the impetus for the webinar today. So the upcoming webinar in the series will be Circular Economy, Restoring Economies and Communities with Dr. Scott Valentine, a world-renowned authority on circular economy, director of the Senior Circular Economy Specialist from KPMG, and that's on July 8th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A little housekeeping. Some of you have kindly shared your questions beforehand. You may also send questions and comments in the Q&A box. And if not covered already, Tom will try to answer those during our session. So let me introduce our speaker. Thomas O'Brien is the Executive Director of the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach, and the Deputy Director of the METRANS Transportation Center, a partnership between California State University, Long Beach, and the University of Southern California. He also serves as the director of the Southwest Regional Surface Transportation Workforce Center. His teaching and research focus is on logistics, supply chain management, and goods movement policy. Dr. O'Brien has a master's degree in urban planning and development and a PhD in policy planning and development from the University of Southern California. He is both an Inno and Eisenhower Transportation Fellow and a member of the Transportation Research Board's Intermodal Freight Transport Committee and Urban Freight Committee. He currently serves as chair of the National Visiting Committee of the National Center for Supply Chain Technology Education for the National Science Foundation and the chair of the Southern California Regional Transit Training Consortium. And in person, Tom is easygoing, humble, and brilliant, and I'm honored to moderate this session today. Tom.
Thank you, Terry. Just want to make sure that everybody can hear me as well. Is that working? Let's see. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, good. First problem overcome. That's good. Terry, thank you for this opportunity. It really is an honor. Given some of the other speakers that I see you're going to be having as part of this series. I'm going to talk a little bit today, as you mentioned, on resilient supply chains and transportation. It's a fairly high-level overview as the topic demands in an hour setting, and I recognize a couple of friendly names on the list of attendees. So I know that they'll keep me in check, because there are a couple people on here who I know a lot about this topic too. I want to make a comment about resiliency before I sort of jump into the presentation, and that is I want to talk a little bit from my perspective as an instructor in a master's program of supply chain management, where I teach logistics management and transportation. So that frames some of my thoughts, and the comments that I make are part of my own experience learning about the ongoing challenges in order to share it with my students. So that's number one. Number two, granted, I have a West Coast bias and probably a port sector bias given where I am in Southern California. So if I make reference to that, it's only meant to contextualize the lessons I want to share from a deeper knowledge set. And then I think maybe most important, I can't talk about resiliency of transport systems without talking about workforce development. It's part of what I do. It's part of the mission of the center that I run. And I think it is critical not only to the future of transport systems, but our regional and national competitiveness when it comes to global trade. So with that in mind, I'd like to jump into it, and let's see if I'm able to, I'll share my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. And we will make sure. Okay, are you seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let me put it in presentation mode, and there we go. Okay, so first a little bit about who we are at CITT and what we do to provide some context for the discussions I'm about to make. So my center is a center housed within the College of Professional and International Education at Cal State Long Beach. You may know that type of operation as an extension. We are mandated and charged with serving the professional and workforce development needs of our communities, both local and beyond, via distance-based learning. Given where we are in Southern California and in Long Beach in particular, a lot of the work that we do is connected to the trade and transportation sector. We've been in existence for over 23 years now. Our flagship programs are industry designed and taught professional designations in global logistics and in marine terminal operations. We are partners with the Port of Long Beach and Long Beach Unified School Districts in a small learning community at a high school in Long Beach called the Academy of Global Logistics. So it's an immersive training over 4 years in logistics for students in the high school, and CITT has over the years played a role in teacher training, industry coordination, and the development in some cases of coordinated projects for the instructors. We have a series of activities, town halls that help us connect the university to the trade and transportation industry, and it provides a forum to share the work that we do. In addition to the education and training, we also have, we're also the Long Beach home to a number of research partnerships that are done in conjunction with the University of Southern California under the rubric of METRANS, with funding from the US Department of Transportation, Caltrans, the Volvo Foundation in Sweden, and the Federal Highway Administration. And all of these give us an opportunity to undertake applied research in freight and logistics, and to study workforce development issues related to the transportation sector. So you'll hear more of that at the end of the program, but we do labor market analysis in the area of transportation. We do career pathway development initiatives and pilot programs. We also want to say that we do a lot through grant-based funding for the public sector. We work closely with Caltrans in running freight academies. We've been doing that since 2005, which provide week-long trainings to the state's planners and engineers on what they should know about the freight system. We're currently working with the California Energy Commission and the Governor's Office of Business Development on a Sustainable Freight Foundations pilot, which is a 40-hour online program marrying information on freight systems with energy systems and compliance, which is increasingly in demand in the workforce. And I also will talk about that later. But the idea is that we come at this from a very applied perspective. We like to use the research side of our center to inform the development of our training programs so that they are relevant and meaningful for the community and for the industry that we serve. I want to today sort of go over, again at a very high level, talk a little bit about freight and the supply chain from my perspective. Suggesting different ways to look at how we identify and assess the effectiveness of different freight and supply chain stakeholders. I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and what we've been observing, both nationally, but with a particular lens on Southern California. Look more broadly at some of the impact of major supply chain trends, and then close with the e-commerce effect in freight and cities and what it means for our supply chains moving forward. So when we traditionally think of supply chains, right, the old model of a linear supply chain starting with manufacturing, moving through distribution, and then getting to the store shelf, is often how it's presented, both in textbooks and in other areas where people are trying to explain what we do. And this was a lot harder task before there were commercials by FedEx and UPS that explained what logistics was using catchy songs. But I want to suggest that when we think about the freight sector and supply chain, we have to look at a more complex set of partners and partnerships and what they bring to the table. It is not linear in the least. It's very circular, and it's complex to the extent that it's growing, it seems almost daily, because of the changing nature of freight movement, right? So the introduction of electric trucks into the supply chain creates a whole new set of partners, stakeholders, and regulatory agencies that we have to be concerned with. There's also, as we extend supply chains globally, new partners that come into play in managing that freight over extended distances. The supply chain, if nothing else, is much more integrated these days. So we can think about it in terms of who the principal movers of the cargo are, right? The carriers. who are the service providers, the third-party logistics organizations, for example, or others who are much more focused on the transfer of information flows that support the movement of goods as opposed to the physical transformation itself, right? And that includes the freight consolidators, customs brokers, warehousing and distribution. We added the postal service here, right, because of their role increasingly in serving the last mile for companies like FedEx. There are companies that are transportation dependent, right, which contribute to supply chain activity, construction of facilities that are both the recipients of cargo or help transfer the cargo, the utilities, mobile personal services and communications, which increasingly serve as intermediaries for freight activities. And then, of course, energy production, which is essential for cargo to move, in whatever form it takes. And then the road and infrastructure maintenance that makes it all possible. Then we go on to the actual people who own and demand the shipment of cargo in the first place, the beneficial cargo owners, BCOs, the retailers, the wholesalers, the manufacturing sector, which create demand for raw supplies, raw materials. 3PLs play a role here in helping facilitate these flows in both directions. And then there are a whole other myriad of different types of very unique niche supply chains, agricultural supply chains. We could add automotive supply chains to the list. But you get the idea that the cargo owners create demands for the systems, for the system, in the transport system and the freight system in the first place. Right? Increasingly, we have a whole host of reverse logistics activities, starting with waste management. But increasingly reverse packaging in an attempt to both minimize the impact on the environment of package that's used in deliveries, and also to reduce the costs through reuse. A company like Walmart actually sort of led the development of standards for reverse packaging through its business model. Retailers, manufacturers, parcel delivery are all part of the reverse logistics system as well. And increasingly in trade gateways and hubs, such as those here in Southern California, empty containers that need to be repositioned back to manufacturing sources in places like Asia require coordination and logistics oversight. And then, of course, there's the infrastructure itself, the highway systems, the local roads, the railroads, ports, airports, pipelines, border crossings, inland waterways, and then the power grid and power infrastructure, which are increasingly being called upon to support freight activity, whether it's electric trucks, other electric generating activities in the supply chain. Terry, I think we have a poll question at this point to make sure that the audience is awake and listening.
We do.
Okay.
Would you like to tell us what a dray is, please?
Yes. So I will end the polling, right? And I will go to my next slide where I talk about, I want to share results. Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to minimize that.
Yeah.
So a dray features into the next slide that I want to show. And Terry, I'm having a problem advancing. Let's see.
You're having,
I don't know if I need to share the slides again, the screen again.
I don't know. Shouldn't have a problem. Just not moving forward, huh?
It is not.
Let's try resharing.
Okay. It is not yet. No.
No. Okay. It just,
There we go. Okay.
okay.
So a dray is actually a three-sided cart. So we actually didn't, I don't think we had anybody who got, who took part in the poll that got the question. It is traditionally a cart attached to a horse or a mule that was used to gather cargo and freight down at the waterfront before containerized goods were moved. And that term dray has evolved in what we call drayage, right? Which now references essentially short haul trucking. And I wanted to point that out because it's part of a different way of looking at the supply chain from my perspective. And that's sort of the political supply chain. And this is a slide that I had put together with a colleague for teaching purposes, and it served me well over a number of years because what it tries to do is take all of those stakeholders from the prior two slides and put them in some way to explain relationships with each other. Boxes of natural allies and dominant actors, government entities, weaker actors, which is not meant to be qualitative judgment, but weaker in terms of their power in the marketplace. And I want to touch upon some of these because they sort of get at some of the broader questions we're going to be talking about moving forward. Normally you would think that ports and steamship lines or ocean carriers and terminal operators would have an adversarial relationship with the union, with the Longshore Union, right? And in fact, they do. But what we try to capture here is the idea that while there may be an inherent adversarial relationship because they're on different sides of the collective bargaining agreement, they play roles as dominant actors in a supply chain. There are a limited number of ocean carriers globally. There are a limited number of global companies that are engaged in the management of terminal operations. And there are certainly a limited number of ports. And these entities on the left-hand side of the screen, these dominant actors, are able to drive decisions about supply chain behavior because of their ability to control cargo movements, to create, establish, and prioritize trade lanes, and the ability, in this case of the Longshore Union, to contribute to a favorable environment for business to go through certain ports because of consistent service or the threat of labor action. Weaker actors are warehousing and distribution, freight forwarders, some of those 3PLs, largely because there are more of them, they're more diversified, they're more distributed, and they're more reactive to the actions taken by the supply chain actors on the left-hand side of the screen. Federal governments, state governments, and local governments sort of hover around all this activity, trying to figure out how they mitigate the impacts while increasing the trade activity, which is an economic benefit to their constituencies. And then you have some of these outside actors, drayage trucking, which does not have the same rights and responsibilities to discuss rates, for example, or to coordinate on rates since deregulation in the 1980s. And they are very much, or often enough, price takers in the system. So it certainly depends upon capacity and supply chain activity. And then you have our Class 1 railroads, which provide a critical link, but are often not at the table because of their ability to move goods across state lines under interstate commerce regulations. And increasingly, I think in the next generation of this slide, I'll increase the size of the import consumer, because through e-commerce and our ability to demand package arrivals at our house at a certain time, next day or same day, we increasingly drive supply chain behavior. This sort of just meant as an organizational tool, but there's certainly a lot of overlap, and this may differ from place to place. But for example, the mayor of Los Angeles recently appointed the CEO of the Port of Los Angeles, Gene Soroka, as the new chief logistics officer for the city, which is sort of a merging of business and government in a way that I think reflects the complexity of it. I do mention that geography does matter when we're talking about all of this. There is a geographical, spatial, and political component to supply chain activity. This is some work that was done by my colleague Jen Giuliano under a grant that we funded through our workforce center, looking at access to logistics work sites. And we, one of the things that we tried to have them understand is where's the density of logistics activity. And for the purposes of our discussion today, this is really about recognizing that the densest locations for logistics trade, supply chain related employment are in and around rail clusters in the Inland Empire, the communities in and around LAX and the ports and the corridors between those two. And then in the rail and manufacturing centers just to the east and south of downtown Los Angeles. It surprises a lot of people, we forget about it, but Los Angeles County is still the largest manufacturing county in the country in terms of output and productivity. So I think this is just a good reminder that understanding logistics activity is broader than a port. It's broader than a rail hub. It's about the accumulation of demand in large metropolitan areas for the services that support those and the connections between all of those. So I want to talk just a little bit now about what we've seen in the wake of COVID-19, what we experienced nationally, but here in Southern California, given our proximity to Asian supply chains and the manufacturing network in Asia, and what we experienced here. Because clearly there's a geographic and spatial and political component to COVID-19 too. So those of you who are in the industry know that there are predictable disruptions in supply chains, and annually Chinese New Year is one of them. And cargo owners, manufacturers will increase orders in the run-up to Chinese New Year in order to make sure that there aren't capacity challenges while much of the nation is shut down for the new year. This was made worse this past year because of the recognition that China was challenged by COVID-19. And so we had China shutting down and a slow return to full production capacity, causing US importers to sort of panic and front load their purchases from Chinese vendors, sort of the buy early, buy often mentality. This creates obviously bottlenecks at all key points in the infrastructure, at the terminal, within drayage capacity, rail capacity, those freight corridors, and in warehousing and distribution, right? So there was a more pronounced supply shock than we would normally expect around the same time of the year. And that was followed by a demand shock with demand side challenges. as COVID-19 progressed and we started shutting down the economy, we had a dramatic change in consumer demand. But with that lack of demand, we had products from both domestic and international supply chains creating choke points along the logistics infrastructure, right? So as China got back up and running, our side of the Pacific was shutting down, creating demand for storage space at factory yards and other storage areas, warehouses, distribution and fulfillment centers for e-commerce were full of product. Non-essential businesses were closed and employees furloughed, so there wasn't any place to deliver the goods to. One of the interesting things that we saw was from the automotive industry, where when supply chains from Asia got back up and running, they landed on US shores, and in many states, while automotive service was considered essential service, automotive sales were not. And so there was no place to send the new automotive products to, and people were not buying them. Ports and port terminals were swamped with containers, particularly those empty containers that would normally be sent back to Asia to be refilled. They were the victims of what we call blank sailings or blankings, which are essentially were canceled port calls by major vessels. Now, different supply chains behave differently. Consumer goods behave differently than agricultural and food supply chains, than automotive supply chains. But this is sort of generally what we've been dealing with. The ports are up and running and working now, but a lot of this is based upon clearing out orders that were made back in February. I think the general expectation is that what we're going to see in the near future is a lot lighter activity, because there were not a lot of purchase orders being placed or filled starting in March. Terry, I think, do we have questions about this? I'm trying to remember.
We do have some questions that concern what the future of commercial transportation will look like in the COVID era. And how do you recommend transportation freight companies better communicate and reassure the public during the pandemic?
Well, so those are good questions, right? This gets ahead a couple of slides, but I would, or maybe even this slide, I would make the argument that the supply chain behaved as well as it could have and performed as well as it could have, given the fluctuation in demand and the uncertainty about the arrival of products. Trucks were moving. There may have been delays in shipping for your Amazon product, but you were able to track it and trace it. You didn't get it as quickly as you wanted, but it did arrive. Some goods were sourced from different locations. So I think post-COVID-19, we'll see changes in some of the performance metrics and some of the planning that will be done, and maybe some coordination, as I'll mention in a moment, about supply chains. But I really think the information points that were coming, the problem wasn't necessarily the supply chain. The problem was panic purchasing. I think the challenges were individuals taking on their own inventory challenges by stocking up certain products like toilet paper and paper towels, which is sort of not something that we hope is repeated, and that I think the supply chain itself handled fairly well. We may have some who disagree. But it might be communicating to us as consumers more information and some reassurance about the supply chain working, and that options that shippers have to move goods in different ways, right? There wasn't necessarily a need to overstock certain items at home because the supply chain has options.
Okay.
And this sort of gets to this point about the post-COVID-19, the first step is admitting you have a problem. The question is, whose problem is it? Is it the manufacturer's problem? Is it the transport sector's problem? Is it warehousing and distribution? or is it on the consumer end? I think that one thing we will see post-COVID-19 is some redundancy for critical supplies. I think there will be better processes put in place for critical items like PPEs, for example, to have domestic production options in place so we aren't entirely reliant upon global supply chains for those, right? I think we might look at supply chains prioritizing some products for domestic consumers. One thing I learned this past week in a conversation was that a lot of the sanitizing wipes that I had assumed were being produced in Asia actually come out of a manufacturing facility in New Jersey. But they were coming through Southern California destined for overseas market, not for domestic consumption. And so maybe there might be some discussion about those supply chains and priority for domestic consumers, but I don't know if it's a question for regulatory agencies or for the manufacturers themselves. I think we'll need to see some better coordination across supply chains with different regulations. Food and agricultural products, particularly those produced domestically, in some cases found their home, but we know that there were not restaurants buying those products. Would there have been a way for us to shift the supply chain so it responded to demand for out of work staffers or the homeless or something that would have made sure that there wasn't food supplies at schools being thrown away, which is some things that we saw, right? And partly that gets to some of the regulatory issues that I'll discuss in a minute. And then, questions, I don't know the answer to this. This is a research question I have, but what did, in Southern California, the theme parks do that were closed with inventory they might have had of food stock or other product that could have been put to other use? The fact that we sort of have very distinct supply chains based upon products, customers, or regulations may be room for improvement. And there's hope there, right? We did see a lot of regulatory agency flexibility as part of this. Customs and Border Protection and the Food and Drug Administration found ways to be much more flexible with regard to labeling, deferment of duties and fees as part of the process. And so if they can demonstrate that flexibility now, can we see it in other circumstances? And connection to environmental measures. In California, we are moving aggressively forward with our shift toward 2030, 2035, zero emission vehicle requirements. How does that work as the economy is getting back up and running? Will there be any flexibility there? And what does it mean for regional and statewide competitiveness? We have to take a look.
Okay.
I want to talk a little bit about some other broader global trends that are occurring now that in the wake of COVID-19 are still issues. They were issues before COVID-19, they're issues now. And I'll start moving a little bit more aggressively through these because I know we're already at 2:44. So one of those are sort of consolidation within the industry, global trade as a whole, the move toward larger vessels for economies of scale on the ocean side, creating impacts. And so we'll Terry, I don't know if we want to risk doing the poll again because
yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. The question I'm going to ask is sort of about the capacity of these larger vessels and what it means for supply chain and demand for landside infrastructure. And the question is, how many pairs of shoes would fit into an 18,000 TEU vessel? And TEU is 20-foot equivalent, which is sort of the container standard. And the poll question asks whether it's 9,000, 90,000, 900,000, 9 million, or 90 million. I'll let you ponder that while I move on to the next slide. Is actually 90 million pairs of shoes. The new vessels that are being brought online have a capacity of more than 23,000 of those 20-foot equivalent units. The Port of LA actually just last week did more moves in a single ship call than any other time in history, recorded history. They moved 18,465 containers in a single call. There we go. Okay. I don't know what. It's on a bit of a delay. I think that's the issue, but that's fine. So let me talk to that slide though for a minute. The idea is that these new larger vessels, which are more than 20 stories tall, wider than a 12-lane freeway, longer than 4 football fields, and with a capacity for 90 million pairs of shoes, create geographic winners and losers, right? You have to have available landside infrastructure, you have to have available labor and equipment, you have to have a favorable regulatory environment, you've got to be able to serve multiple markets, national as well as local, particularly for the last mile, and you have to be able to respond to shifts in global trade patterns, right? We're already seeing a shift in manufacturing activity moving further west in Asia, which makes the Suez Canal more attractive to some shippers than the Panama Canal, and favors trade gateways on the east coast of North America. This consolidation in the industry, it means that we'll be seeing subsequent consolidation, perhaps in terminal operations. There's been in the recent year also a trend toward more of port consolidation, like what happened in Seattle and Tacoma. This is the next slide, and it's on resiliency and managing the last mile. This is something that my friend and colleague Jean-Paul Rodrigue put together to sort of show the changing nature of supply chains driven by last mile operations, and the fact that what has been an industry that likes massification increasingly depends upon atomization at the local level. So you've got a conflict between sort of the economies of scale effort on the ocean side and the customized high frequency, low volume trade at the last mile. And Terry's still having problems, so I'm just gonna I'll try this again.
Not know why.
Okay, I'm gonna stop share and try it again.
Yeah, thank you. And otherwise, I
know you have a copy as well.
yeah, I can try to share.
Okay, yeah. So let me just, while this slide is up, talk a little bit about resiliency and managing the last mile. One of the things that is a challenge that the last mile creates is the need to sort of integrate the consumer-related distribution side with producer-related distribution, all in an environment that conflicts with a lot of the smart growth goals and sustainable city goals that we're seeing, right? Increasing truck demand in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, because of the number of deliveries, while there are efforts to reduce road capacity. And we're seeing this sort of in the wake of the last 2 months. Efforts to remove parking at a time when we have more curbside deliveries. The desire to create more car and truck free zones, which have the unintended consequence of moving freight to somewhere else and impacting somebody else. And mixed use developments creating increasing demand for shared space between residential life and business life. Okay, I don't.
You can do it.
Not doing it.
Wow. And my screen seems to have somewhat cut out because my picture isn't up.
Yeah, if you want to, I can talk, and if you want to take over and show the screen.
I will try.
Yeah.
I actually All right, let me try to do that.
Let me, and I'll just talk because we're sort of nearing the end, but
Yes.
a couple of things. It's too bad I have an interesting slide that once again I draw upon from my colleague, Jose Holguin Veras, who has a really interesting slide that he used from Julius Caesar's Roman code, which talks about the attempt to control last mile logistics from BC 45 and trying to make the point that that this is not a new problem, but it's the consequences of when you avoid the freight activity, you create problems for yourself. I also talk about the unintended consequences of prohibiting trucks of a certain size. There we go. Okay. And then if you want to go on to the next one, the next slide.
Absolutely.
These are some sort of examples of managing last mile. And then Terry, actually, this isn't the most recent presentation on your. So I'll just continue. But the idea being, right, that on this slide, if you limit the size of trucks, what ends up happening is that you create demand for more smaller vehicles, still taking up curb space. And then the notion of how do we manage and try to accommodate freight within the landscape of urban planning issues. We look often to places like Europe for the concept of high-rise logistics facilities, logistics hotels, which provide multiple services in and around the urban core, including rooftop parks, access to rail shuttles that I think we'll be seeing looked at here in Southern California and in other places where we have some space to be able to do that. I want to close with issues of resiliency and workforce development because that's one of the things that I'm charged to do is help identify needs for training programs on a regular basis. And in the slide deck that I'll be sharing with you through Terry, you'll have access to these. I have a slide that we developed that was sort of based on a study that JP Morgan Chase did on employment in Southern California. It's not in this slide deck, Terry, so you may just want to. And it looks at building and mixing employment-based occupations in the logistics sector with industry-valued certifications. And then we layer on top of that, I show some skill sets that are being developed that are increasingly in demand in logistics when you look at job postings that are not necessarily about the logistics sector at all, right? Increasing use of artificial intelligence in training in warehouse. At the middle level, there we go, right? So this is the slide that shows the it's the occupational pyramid for logistics where you build skill sets, but we laid on top of it industry valued certifications, different transportation related skills. When we talk to students, we talk about the fact that the logistics and trade sector is actually a reliable employment sector, even with the onset of automation in certain sectors. And there's a combination of skill sets that come from certificate programs, community college-based programs that actually translate into well-compensated positions in the workplace. If you go on to the next slide, Terry.
Yep.
And this was sort of our something else where we sort of did a 3-layer entry, mid, and advanced level, not focusing on the occupation itself, but skill sets and competencies that were being demanded by employers in job listings. We do a lot of research using things like monster.com and indeed.com. And these are things that, if taught in training programs, or that are incorporated into capstone projects, or for students at any level, if you can build in research development skills, then you're actually building a well-prepared workforce for the future. This is a slide from partners of ours in Tucson, Arizona, which is where one of the starting points for automated trucking tests between Arizona and Texas. And this surprises a lot of people, because this is sort of something of an oxymoron. It is a new certificate program for autonomous vehicle driving. And that's because in the transition to automation, there are going to be, for the foreseeable future, in my opinion, opportunities to elevate the skills of people who own commercial driver's license to do diagnostics for systems that are in the cab. In every state that allows autonomous truck testing requires people to be in the cab. Next. And then this is the last slide. And this is my effort to, my call to action to make sure that young people in K through 12 get exposed to logistics and technology and tools, because we don't have a resilient transportation or supply chain system if we don't have a resilient workforce. And these are some examples from the high school program that I talked about, from a training program that we did with the community college. Those students in the lower center are using a walk audit app that our own students at Cal State Long Beach developed, that allows them to engage and observe the surroundings of their school from a freight and logistics perspective. Where is there potential interference between a bus stop, an Uber drop-off, a convenient Uber drop-off point, and a loading and truck and unloading zone. And so by doing this, I think, again, my call to action is that what we as an industry should be doing, and I include myself as part of that, is making sure that there's access to good jobs by making sure that students have an awareness of this as a real career pathway and not jobs. And with that, I will close.
So Tom, let me stop sharing for a minute. Tom, we, because of the little confusion with the frozen, with the technology, we missed a few of the questions, which I'd like to just try to hit on. I know it is 3 o'clock. Hopefully attendees have a few more minutes, because I know that these were questions that were being asked. So, for instance, should an emphasis be placed on removing road-based transport and placed on rail, electric infrastructure to move goods more quickly and efficiently?
The answer is sort of one of those, it depends. I mean, where cargo moves efficiently and effectively by rail, particularly in North America, where we have the best rail freight network in the world, I think, it already does so, right? The general rule of thumb is that rail pencils out at about a 500-mile trip. Anything short of that, it's going to go by a truck. And in fact, even if it goes by rail, it's going to go by a truck at either end. So what matters to the people who move the goods are sort of the labor costs, time to market, infrastructure capacity, and congestion. And where rail makes sense, it does. It already goes that way. I think there is, over the last decade or so, the Class 1 railroads have invested in double tracking, double stacking to increase its capacity. And that's made a tremendous difference. And also over time, rail has shifted from its principal client, which used to be coal, to intermodal operations. And as the network is designed specifically for those purposes, it will be more competitive. But keep in mind that in many places, like you said, in California, there are mandates to move truck drayage and over the road to electrification to meet statewide zero emission transport goals.
Okay, just we have a few more questions, but I just want to kind of hit some highlights. How do you envision a paradigm shift in the mentality within your industry to accept changes to a more sustainable transport model and thereby make a positive impact on the environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. For years, the supply chain sort of flew under the radar. We didn't have demand like we do now for next day and same day delivery, as I mentioned earlier. So one of the things is that it's very easy for the supply chain to sort of hand off the problem and the impacts to their partners, right? It's generated by manufacturing, right? That's where the waste is generated. Or it's the transport sector, I'm just the consumer. I think increasingly we'll see things like pricing mechanisms address some of the questions, right? If we as consumers paid the true cost of delivery to our homes, then that might create changes in supply chain behavior that would result in more consolidated packaging that comes in 2 days instead of 1 day. In fact, you know, Amazon, right? You have the option to select different delivery options, and that's one way to be more sustainable. Partly it's carrot and stick on the transport side. We've had some challenges with the move towards zero emission vehicles on the trucking side, partly because of cost of purchase, the nature of the industry, which builds the ability to resell the vehicle to a secondary market into the operating costs that are amortized over time. That challenge has to be solved. The range of vehicles, right? The bigger your battery, the less your payload. So over time, I think the technology will get there. But what I hear industry, say is that the technology just doesn't have to work. It has to be commercially viable, right? Technology can exist, right? But it has to make sense for the market to bear it.
And I seem to have lost you now. You there?
I'm here.
Okay. So let me see. Do we have any other questions here that have come up? And we're going to close. Let's see. Okay. Let me get out of this. Let me get out of this. This. All right. Let me see if there's any more questions. Questions? No. Okay. So I want to thank you so much for generously sharing your time and expertise to address these critical and timely issues of supply chains and transportation in the wake of COVID-19, as well as answering our questions. Tom has let me know that if any of you have further questions, you can email him. And if you've not noted his email address, just reach out to me and I'll make the connection. And we hope to be able to put the PowerPoint, the correct PowerPoint, up on my website. This recording will be posted on my website as well. LINKCO Executive Search provides elite companies with top CXOs and upper management nationwide, using a proprietary step-by-step process for both clients and candidates. We're on 24/7, 365. When you need help, please call upon us. The next webinar is July 8th at 3 p.m. on the circular economy. It's posted on the website. reserve your seat. And thank you so much for attending today.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.